This is Ex-Mormon Bible Study on 1 Corinthians 15, verse 29. What was Paul really talking about when he briefly mentioned baptisms for the dead? I see three possible interpretations based on the context of the entire letter and the historical context of Corinth. Most people know that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is trying to convince the people of the reality of the resurrection. But what I've also found is that he's also trying to dissuade the people from believing in reincarnation, specifically human to animal reincarnation. You see, Corinth, Greece is not far from Athens, Greece, where all of the famous pagan philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates had taught the people their philosophies about life, death, and reincarnation. Plato specifically had taught that humans can die and based on the merit of their lives can reincarnate into an animal form. So the first interpretation of baptisms for the dead within this context is that there could have been pagans among the believers baptizing their dead, perhaps thinking that it could help them attain a more favorable reincarnation. Paul challenges this idea in verses 37 through 39, where he mentions that if you plant a seed, it will only grow into the plant from which it came from. And he likens that to our bodies. Our bodies will only resurrect into the physical form from which we came from. So like a wheat seed will only grow into wheat, a human will only resurrect into a human. It's also interesting to note that throughout the letter, when he was talking to the believers, he is saying we preach, we are found, we believe. And when he gets to baptisms for the dead, he says they that are baptized for the dead. He doesn't use the inclusive term because it's not we, it's not us, it wasn't his people doing it. The second interpretation is that maybe some of the believers were practicing this, but look what Paul says afterwards and see if you can tell if he's in support or not of this practice. He says they're baptized for the dead, and why are they standing in jeopardy? He protests by their rejoicing. He warns them not to be deceived and tells them to awake to righteousness. This sounds like he's telling them to stop. He said, if you're being baptized for the dead, you're standing in jeopardy. I protest. Be not deceived and wake up to righteousness. Stop doing this. The third interpretation is that Paul is speaking metaphorically, comparing death to sin, asking the people, why are you even baptized for forgiveness of sin and salvation if you're not going to be resurrected from the dead? Paul uses death as a metaphor for sin 3 times in this letter. The first time in verses 17 and 18, he says, if Christ wasn't raised from the dead, we are still in our sin and perish. So if Christ wasn't physically redeemed from the dead, we are still spiritually under sin and death as well. So we need to be spiritually and physically redeemed from the dead. The next place is in verse 31 when Paul says, I die daily. Obviously, he did not physically die every day, but like all of us, he sinned every day. And lastly, verse 56, he says the sting of death is sin. All of these metaphors support Paul's argument in saying, why are our spiritually dead souls even baptized if there is no redemption or resurrection? One or more of these scenarios could be true at the same time, but one thing is for sure. When Joseph Smith said that Paul was trying to prove the doctrine of resurrection by teaching the people baptisms for the dead by proxy, this is absolutely contextually unfounded and untrue. Paul did not in any way promote the practice of baptisms for the dead. He was calling out the people's flawed logic and lack of understanding of the gospel. You can read more about the biblical contradictions and false doctrines that Joseph Smith taught about the practice of baptisms for the dead in my article on exmormonbiblestudy.com.